My apologies, I had to do some speed reading here. All right. So thank you to John for leading our study last week. You guys covered 2 chapters in Ezra, 9 and 10. Ezra chapter 9, you get this wonderful confession and prayer about the sin of intermarriage that God gave, or that the people committed. And then in verse 10, you had, or chapter 10, I'm sorry, you had a pretty extreme solution to those marriages. So I just wanted to throw in my 2 cents worth. So any time you talk about any kind of an intermarriage, for the unbelieving world, that's going to center around race, okay? And that, of course, is a false understanding, because there's only one human race, right? We are all descendants from Adam and Eve. So the concept of race in terms of humanity did not get included in the kind of the common thought until you get to Darwin. Darwin, most people are familiar with his book on the origin of species, where he postulates, he puts into print the theory of evolution. But what most evolutionists don't do is they don't read his second book, because he took his theory and he applied it to human beings, all right? He applied the theory of evolution to human beings. It's called The Descent of Man, is the title of that book. And the reason why most evolutionists avoid it is because it is horrific. Because his argument is basically that in nature, if you have a defective offspring in nature, the mother either kills it or abandons it, right? She doesn't waste any of the resources on that defective offspring. And so he makes the same case for human beings. He identifies 7 races of human beings, but he delineates them on what he says is an evolutionary basis, right? And so of those 7 races that he identifies, there is only one that's at the pinnacle of evolution, and that is the white Europeans, okay? And any of the other, whether it is black or oriental, or even go farther down to the Aborigines, they were not as evolved, so they were considered as lesser, as inferior, okay? Not even much above animals, all right? In fact, one of the darkest periods in European colonial history was with the island of Tasmania, because the Europeans completely annihilated, total genocide against the native population of Tasmanians. In fact, the British Museum of Natural History would put a bounty on Tasmanians. If you could deliver a preserved Tasmanian corpse, they wanted to study it. And in fact, they kept the last native Tasmanian corpse, the remains, up until the 1950s, I believe, before they finally returned the remains of the last native Tasmanian so she could be laid to rest. But there are no native Tasmanians. They're all gone because the Europeans murdered them all, because evolutionarily speaking, they were inferior. And of course, Darwin then got into the topic of eugenics, of trying to then, if animals abandon or kill their defective offspring, or their aged pride members, extended family members, whatnot, Nature didn't tolerate the ill or the infirm or the deformed or the really old, right? Those became food. And he said, since human beings are just the highest order of evolved animals, that we should do the same. So he advocated just this horrendous treatment of the sick, the ill, the infirmed, or even human beings that they believed were lesser. Anyone ever been to the Bronx Zoo in New York City? Back in the early 1900s, just after 1904. In 1904, the World's Fair in St. Louis, they had a display, an evolutionary display, and they had brought a number of Aboriginal folks and black folks from, whether it's Australia, from Africa. One of the fellows they grabbed from Africa was a fella named Ota Benga. And Ota Benga was put on display at the World's Fair. And then after the World's Fair was over, he was donated to the Bronx Zoo. And he was actually put in a cage and put on display for people to come and visit. And you'll never guess who was the organization that was most strongly opposed to that, and that would be the church. And the pastors of many different denominations threw an unholy fit until Ota Benga was released. And then the churches in their charity had given Ota a place to live, and they gave him a job. He wound up being a janitor for a while. But in his absence, his wife and children had been murdered by a rival African tribe. And the grief and the trauma that Ota experienced was too much, and he wound up taking his own life eventually. So the answer is, yeah, we wonderful Americans are also guilty of putting a human being in a cage and putting him on display. But that's all, again, because of the theory of evolution. So whenever you hear intermarriage, non-believers and even too many believers, unfortunately, are going to go to the issue of race. But again, the issue of race is not in Scripture at all. There is one human race, and that is all of us, okay? We can marvel at the genetic diversity that God built into our human race. So whenever Scripture talks about intermarriage, it's going to be between believers and unbelievers. It's not a physical state, it is a spiritual one. Bob?
What you just said reminded me of a situation around years ago when my wife and I went to Tanzania in Africa, and we asked our guide, we don't see any mentally retarded people here. He said, no, they're born mentally retarded or deformed. The parents just take them out in the savannah and leave them there. So they don't, again, it's the same principle of, like you said, about the animals.
They can't wait the resources, yeah.
Right.
Yep.
They don't choose to spend the resources that they have on them.
Right. Even more modern, and I hate to say this with you and Emily here, but the nation of Iceland, they were proud that the nation of Iceland has cured Down syndrome, according to them. But by cure, what they mean is they abort any child diagnosed with Down's syndrome. So there are none in the nation of Iceland. They have, unless families leave the nation in order to have that child. Oh, yes, ma'am. To this very day.
Even in the United States, I can't remember the percentage.
Oh, the percentage is huge. I was going to say if it's just strictly 80, I would push back and say that's too low. I think it's higher. If it's in the high 80s, that I would believe. They're still simply aborted because, again.
It's not just, Down syndrome. It's in.
Oh yeah, any yeah.
Identified as
Right.
perfect.
Right. And of course, you have the same organization that is pushing back against that, at the top of our lungs, and that, of course, is the church. Anyway, so just whenever the Bible talks about intermarriage, it's always going to be a spiritual condition. All right? And I'm going to be so bold as to say that prohibition still exists. I wound up, especially earlier in my career, officiating a lot of weddings. The church I served when I got there as a brand new pastor out of seminary, the two established pastors that were there, the senior pastor and the retired pastor, they both had the practice that they didn't require people to join the church, to become members in order to have a wedding there. I mean, you had to meet with the pastors and go through premarital counseling, but you didn't have to join the church. And so the church had these beautiful stained glass windows, and because you didn't have to become a member, I guess word just got out in the community, because I must have done anywhere from about 15 weddings a year for the first 20 years of my ministry. Just nowadays, after COVID, people go to more venues than into a church. But back in those days, church weddings were a big thing. And the old time pastor, it was really his practice that kind of carried on for the two pastors that succeeded him. But he simply said, you get a chance to proclaim the gospel in a large group of people. And he said, yeah, there's not a whole lot of fruit that you can see, but that doesn't mean that God isn't at work. And so he was the one that taught me that, when you're doing a wedding, your audience is not the bride and groom. They're not going to remember a word of what you say. I don't remember a word of what the pastor said at my wedding. I don't. But the people sitting in the pews, they are paying attention. And so you make it a positive experience, and then if God blesses that couple with children and they want to get the kiddos baptized, they already have this connection. Hey, we got married here, and they'll call up and say, hey, we're not members, but can we get our kiddos baptized? And the answer is, well, absolutely yes. And you make that a good experience, and then the kiddos get on the cradle roll, and then for 3 years, until the kiddo gets into preschool, every quarter they get this mailing from the church. It was a wonderful system. And then when they get to be preschool age, because our church had a preschool, they got the invitation to come and join. So it was just kind of a neat. And again, all you would do was invite. And would you see a whole lot of fruit from that? The answer is no. But again, just because we don't see it doesn't mean that God isn't at work. But I tell that to say this. So again, after 29, going on now 29 and a half years, I've only ever declined to do 2 weddings where I said, no, I can't do it. Because one, the person was a Buddhist, and the other one, one of the couple was Jewish. And I had asked, do you plan on converting to Christianity? If that's the case, then I will. officiate that wedding if you're planning to join your spouse in the Christian faith. But both times they said no, they were going to, one was going to stick to their religion and one was going to stick to the other, and love was going to conquer all. But again, history shows us what? So why would God put the prohibition in the first place? Because what happens? Yeah, so it is possible that you can convert your spouse. And I'm going to use the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod. And if I asked how many of you became Missouri Synod Lutherans because you married into the denomination, you'll get a fair number of hands that will pop up. To be honest, marriage is probably our most effective method of evangelism. All right? But historically, that tends to be the minority. Generally, what happens is what? Is that the believing spouse will then gravitate towards the unbelieving spouse. And when kids get part of the equation, right? You've all raised kids. You understand raising kids on a difficulty scale of 1 to 10 is probably about a 15, okay? And so when you then are left with one parent saying, well, we've got to get up on Sunday morning and sit on our rambunctious kiddos for an hour or an hour and a half if Pastor Kurt's leading the service, and, give part of our budget that's already stretched and make all of these sacrifices, and you don't have both parents on board with that, again, what tends to happen? It just tends to drift away. Or if you want to try and raise your kiddo with both faiths. I preached this message in my previous congregation, and there was a very prominent member whose daughter had married a Jewish fella, and she loved her son-in-law. He was a wonderful human being, and I imagine that he was. Took great care of his wife and her grandchildren, and so they decided that they would just raise their kids in both faiths, tell them that they're both true and they're both equal. But the problem, of course, is what? That's not the case. That is heresy. We call that sin syncretism, where you blend the religions together. And so, again, God put this pretty strict prohibition on his people. And because all these Israelites, as they get into the promised land, because they're all pre-Lutherans, from the very beginning, they choose to ignore what God says. So when God led them into the promised land, right, he parts the river Jordan, and in they go. The land is occupied, so they have to fight for it, right? And they go city by city, territory by territory, and the land is occupied, and they have to fight for it. And they kill the warriors, and God says, you've got to exterminate them all. Men, women, children, livestock, all of it. And the Israelites went, wait a minute, God, time out. That's a little cold. They didn't have any problems wiping out the men, but the women and the children, they wouldn't do. They left them. And of course, they wound up intermarrying. And what happens is, of course, then the devout worship of the living God becomes the watered-down quasi-worship of a whole bunch of regional gods. The Baals, the Molechs, take your pick, Asherah, and Israel struggled with that its entire history. Okay? So, John had mentioned to me that, again, in Ezra chapter 10, there was this feeling amongst us of a little bit of uneasiness, right? Because you can point to the passages where it says, wait a minute, doesn't this prophet say, hey, God hates divorce? And doesn't Jesus quote that prophet? And the answer is yes. So why then do you have this extreme reaction in Ezra chapter 10, where they take and they list, these are just the priests, okay? These are just the priests. And of course, you understand, you know this tactic of Satan, right? Because if he can get the spiritual leaders to do what? To stray, okay? Then the lay people do what? Oh, hey, if Dr. So-and-so, if priest so-and-so, if pastor so-and-so, hey, he's got 3 wives, then why can't I? You know? And look at the damage, even in our own culture, right? Even in our own culture. How many denominations have strayed from the Word of God and are now leading all of these countless people astray? So, in the realm of apologetics, where you are defending the Word of God, there was an appointed person. Eugenie Scott was her name, and she was the head of the National Council of Sciences or whatnot. And I'm going back about 20 years. But again, and this is a very evolutionary organization, right? And she said whenever they would try and have meetings and they would try to evangelize people to buy into the theory of evolution, she said, if I can get one pastor on board, he's worth 3 scientists. All right? And again, you've all lived it. You've all seen it, right? What did Jesus say? Strike the shepherd and the sheep will scatter. That's why Satan targets the shepherds so much, right? He wants the shepherd to fall and to fail because that's how he can do the most amount of damage to God's people. And so in the book of Ezra here, you've got the priests, you've got the shepherds. These were the guys who were the ones who would lead worship. John's going to bring his lamb to the priest so the priest can sacrifice his lamb so John's sins can be forgiven. And meanwhile, the priest is what? Already living in this sin. Okay? And you can look back at the prayer, right? Look at Ezra's prayer. What did he say? Chapter 9, beginning at verse 6. Oh my God, I am ashamed, and I blush to lift my face to you, my God, for our iniquities have risen higher than our heads, and our guilt has mounted up to the heavens. From the days of our fathers to this day, we have been in great guilt. And for our iniquities, we, our kings and our priests, have been given into the hand of the kings of the lands, to the sword, to captivity, to plundering, to utter shame, as it is today. But now, for a brief moment, favor has been shown by the Lord our God to leave us a remnant and to give us a secure hold within this holy place, that our God may brighten our eyes and grant us a little reviving in our slavery, for we are slaves. Ezra's looking back to the very time when Joshua leads the people into the promised land. They war for a couple years, and then they stop fighting, and the people go to their respective allotments of ground, and what do they start doing? They start intermarrying from the very beginning. And what did this lead to? It led to the Baals. It led to the Molechs. It led to the Asherah. It led to all of this idolatry. And so Ezra can look back and he can see it clear as day. Because of this sin, we ignored you, God, and look what this has done to us. Right? How many of you had immediate family that lived through the Great Depression? I'll bet that those were some miserly sons of guns. That they would throw nothing away, they would save everything because they were worried about what? It might happen again, right? They lived through that misery, and for the rest of their life, their behavior was impacted by that, okay? Ezra's doing the same thing. He can look back and he can say, this sin right here, out of all the sins that we have committed, God, this is the one that has reared up and done what? Made us slaves. This idolatry. They're slaves back in their own country. Right?
I grew up in Detroit, and we were Baptist people. We had a Baptist church, and so on. But then I started playing with the ones that were, they weren't Baptist. And I got invited to their a young person became a member of their church. And they asked me if I wanted to be part of that, and I had no idea what I was doing, but yeah, well, I don't like to miss it.
Well, thankfully it was still a Christian organization. It was still a Christian church. There are going to be plenty of Baptists in heaven. So part of the reason why you get such an extreme reaction by Ezra and by the people of Israel is that they can see this long history of sin and wrong, hundreds of years of wrong and idolatry, and they don't want to do what? They don't want to repeat the same mistakes. They don't want to repeat the same sin. But now notice, and this is what caught my eye as I was kind of reading through. Chapter 10, let's start at verse 12. Then all the assembly answered with a loud voice, "It is so, we must do as you have said." All right, so the assembly agrees that these intermarriages cannot continue. But the people are many, and it is a time of heavy rain. We cannot stand in the open, nor is this a task for one day or for two, for we have greatly transgressed in this matter. Let our officials stand for the whole assembly. Let all in our cities who have taken foreign wives come at appointed times, and with them the elders and judges of every city, until the fierce wrath of our God over this matter is turned away from us. Okay, so what did they begin to do? Was there mass divorce and kicking out of people on that day? And the answer is no, there was not. They set up kind of an organized, kind of a bureaucratic way of dealing with this. They were going to go city by city, and within that city, they were going to go family by family. All right? On the first day of the 10th month, they sat down to examine the matter, and by the first day of the first month, they had come to the end of all the men who had married foreign women. And so I imagine we're going to put the best construction on our neighbors here, okay? And I would imagine that if the family was going to decide that, okay, you are a Moabitess, like our ancestor Ruth, right? What did Ruth do? Ruth converted and raised their children in the Jewish faith. It was acceptable to have converts. So I would imagine that the families were given a choice. You know, you convert, you become Jewish, you raise your children Jewish, or you're going to be exiled from the community. And so the folks that chose to remain faithful, I'm sure were given their time, and then those that refused, well, were exiled. All right, my time is up. Thanks for putting up with my ranting, but it's a good topic of discussion.